The reason that we want to discuss the whitewashing of statues, history and culture is because of recent events that have happened. So, for example, the removal of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol and subsequent trekking in the river. And a few days ago, an Oxford College backed calls to remove Cecil Rhodes' statue after a long campaign of Rhodes Must Fall. We can look at the recent events in London where far-right protesters basically took to the streets in defence of their Winston Churchill statue. We can also look at events like Hoddesdon, where a group of racists came out to defend their supposed culture, even though nobody was there to actually take down the statue. And so all of this kind of brings us the question, why are people getting so enraged over statues? And for Black and brown people, these statues serve to perpetuate the racist structure in which we live. It basically says to them, your history is not worthy. It is our white history that is worthy. It is our culture that is important. And on the opposing end, for certain white people, aka people that call themselves pure British lads or sons of England, this kind of anger at the whole statue situation is because what they consider to be their culture, which is in fact white supremacy, is being attacked. And so this is a true display of white fragility as the comfortable rug of white dominance is being pulled from under their feet. But obviously we know that removing statues is not erasing white culture. It's essentially just painting a more accurate picture of history. So we need to talk about the erasure of Black and brown culture from our history and from our present day world.
Yeah. So, the countries that me and Lisa are coming from, and the other countries that are generally similar. So we're talking about France, UK, US, Canada, et cetera. These are historically powerful nations, and they're powerful because of their past in slavery, in colonialism, and in imperialism. And so in the 50s and 60s, we saw formal decolonization take place, but we know, if you're attending this, it's probably because you know that racism is still very much present, and that not much, if nothing, has been put in place to change, actually change the way that things are. And so I think today, with social media and the era that we live in, voices which have always been silenced are now being heard, and I don't think we like it. And so, part of white supremacy is the adaptability of its system. We no longer we still live in a white supremacist system, but it doesn't look like it did 50, 100, 150 years ago. And so right now people are calling for an undoing of systemic racism, systemic and institutional racism. And so we're going to try to kind of explain how we got to where we are and why this conversation is important.
Yep, so I want to start off this conversation with addressing slavery. Usually when we do these seminars, we start at slavery because, slavery marks the beginning of the current paradigm of white supremacy in which we live. And so, it lays the foundation for our current perceptions of Africans and of the African diaspora. So I want to start off by talking about the Middle Passage. So the Middle Passage is basically the journey of slaves from West Africa to the Americas. And, we know that Black people were forcibly, snatched from their land and dumped onto a land unfamiliar to them, and a land which was designed for their exploitation. So academics such as Paul Gilroy used the Middle Passage as a metaphor for this vanishing of history. Slaves from different places with different customs, who spoke different languages, who practiced different religions, were basically all of their unique culture was annihilated, and instead they were homogenized to merely a slave. And even when they reached the plantations in the Americas, they were not allowed to use their native names, their languages, their heathen religions, or express their native customs. And so this is the beginning of the white-black dichotomy, in which manifests still and is deeply entrenched in our society today, where we say that white culture is good. Christianity is good, like white customs are good, and black culture is bad, it's heathen, it's wicked. And, you know, we know that race was constructed. We know that race was constructed through this time in order to subjugate black people and to control them. And so, you know, the slaves were a homogenous machinery. They were not people, they were objects. And how do you make like an object, or how do you make a person like a good kind of part of machinery? You know, you take away their identity, you take away any of their individuality, you take away their culture, and you say to them, you know, your purpose is just to work and breed. So yeah, so I've spoken about like the Middle Passage as, you know, a metaphor for the vanishing of slavery, but similarly, we can look at the Scramble of Africa as another incident of, you know, bleaching culture and bleaching history. And so the Scramble of Africa took place between 1881 and 1914. And so basically this was when the African continent was essentially just like divided up by Europeans, and it was like a free-for-all land grab. It was like, you know, a pick and mix. You know, I'll take this country, I'll take that country. And, you know, nobody talks about Africa before Europeans invaded it, like, you know, the invasion of Africa started African history, perhaps with the exception of, you know, the Egyptian or ancient Egypt. But what happened between those years? What happened from, you know, or what happened like following ancient Egypt up until, you know, colonialism? We don't talk about people such as Mansa Musa, who was the, you know, the richest man to ever live, and he was a Malian emperor in the 14th century, and he would comparably be richer than Jeff Bezos today. We don't talk about people such as Queen Nzinga, who is a great military and diplomatic leader of Ndonga and Matamba, which is now present-day Angola, and who fought off the Portuguese. And, you know, our history is bleached, and even within, you know, the former colonies themselves, history is also bleached. And so I want to give an example of Zambia, because I'm half Zambian, so I, you know, like to kind of give an example that I know about anyway. And so in Zambia, Zambia is basically home to one of the natural wonders of the world, namely Victoria Falls. So Victoria Falls is like this great big waterfall in Zambia, and it was supposedly discovered in 1855 by Scottish explorer David Livingstone. And so obviously, you know, how do you discover the world's 4th largest waterfall? You know, it doesn't make sense. But the thing is, that waterfall, Victoria Falls, obviously he named it that after our Queen Victoria. And essentially just the naming of that and the fact that that's still used as its name today is bleaching Zambian culture, because formerly it was known as Missio Tunya, which means the smoke that thunders. But even today, you know, Victoria Falls is the name that it is given. And also I think it's interesting to note that when I was telling my mum about this seminar, she basically told me that when she was at school in Zambia, she used to sing songs about David Livingstone. And some of these songs would be in her native tongue, and basically the songs would glorify him. And, you know, she had to sing these songs at school. It's, you know, it's part of like this indoctrination, of Western, like white culture. And we can also see within the empire, the way that Europe like colonized people, and the way that Europe achieved domination is by, you know, kind of the tool of language, you know, saying that English language is, you know, the optimum, and if you speak any other language, then, you know, you're heathen, or you're less civilized. We can talk about the school curriculums. Issa will be talking about these two things a bit later on. But we can also talk about sports, and sport is something that we see, or we see as like a harmless thing, you know. But it's interesting because Britain's expansion of its empire coincided with the popularity of sports in the UK, such as cricket, rugby, and golf. And so, you know, the idea was that sport created better citizens, but we can also argue its role as a subtle tool for creating docile subjects You know, we can look at India and the use of cricket and how, you know, it's still popular today. So this topic of like sport as a tool for cultural domination is the topic of Brian Stoddart's essay entitled Sports, Cultural Imperialism and Colonial Response in the British Empire. And he says, through sport were transferred dominant British beliefs as to social behavior, standards, relations, and conformity. And it's also important to note that, you know, the slaves on the plantations and the indigenous people in the colonized countries far outweighed the presence of white Europeans. Therefore, this cultural imperialism was needed in order for the continual subjugation of these people. And again, I just want to conclude this little section by saying it's not as if Black people willingly handed, you know, their culture and their values. You know, they fought a resistance through this. We can see songs, stories, spiritual customs, names that were passed down like covertly through slavery. And arguably, we can say a similar thing about the empire, although it's not like the exact same kind of basis. But yeah, as I said, this was a tool for like resistance and revolt. You know, Black people have been fighting for the preservation of their culture since the beginning of slavery.
Yeah. So now I'm going to talk about kind of the other side of that, which is the creation of, I'm going to be talking about nationalism. So there's this kind of underlying idea that I think we're taught very young, which is that, you know, humans need to belong to a group, and often that group is defined in opposition to another group. According to Eric Hobsbawm, who's a British author, in order to create, we need nationalism for 3 reasons. We needed to create social cohesion and a sense of belonging. We needed to indoctrinate a value system and behavioral conventions, as Lisa was mentioning earlier, and we needed to legitimize institutions and authorities. Ernest Gellner goes a little bit further and says that nationalism invents the nation, it comes before it. And so with industrialization came an increased demand for standardized education. And with that came a homogenization of culture. And we see that, you know, on a local and global level. He argued that nationalism is a evolving and fluid and highly adaptable historical process, just like white supremacy is. And he didn't make the link with white supremacy, I don't think, but I'm just putting it out there. And then Benedict Anderson goes a little bit further himself, and he adds that with the downfall of dynasties and generally dynastic political structures, for example, in France, so when that happened, that's happened at the same time as the downfall of religious institutions who were losing power and people were less religious. So with that came the development of the secular state, and nationalism became the new faith. It replaced religion and took on its role of this common story between all these people, this group. And so capitalism is very important here, because with the development and generalization of printing and print capitalism, there was now simultaneously a rise in standardized homogeneous education and a rise in literacy rates. And so what that means is that everybody could read, and they could read the same books in school, and they could read the same articles in their newspapers. And that is key in maintaining the narrative of nationalism. And so we know, you know, if you look at our past seminars, or, you know, probably if you're here, you probably know that, you know, a lot of, well, no, the entire premise of the United States and of contemporary Europe is rooted in colonial ideas that everything white is better. And when I say that, I'm thinking of knowledge, culture, language, art, way of thinking, traditions, food, anything, absolutely anything. And, you know, there have been choices made as to what history we keep and present and put on pedestals, and what history we leave out. And so there's kind of this collective amnesia. And it's quite interesting, because in the West nowadays, generally nationalism doesn't have a good name, you know. I know there are Trump voters and there are Brexit voters, but you know, generally it's not it doesn't have, it's not very well like it doesn't have a very good connotation. And the reality that we have invented those narratives, and that those narratives have enabled our nation to think that they had the right to enslave and colonize, made them as powerful as they are, but that has consequences, and it's still the case, you know. And signing a paper, in the case of slavery, you know, signing a paper abolishing it doesn't mean in any way that there was a, you know, an uproot of the colonial ideas that are the very foundation of our societies. And that's why we're trying to have this conversation.
Yep, so Aesop just discussed nationalism. So now I want to talk about collective memory. So collective memory is something that is a tool for like cohesion of like a nationalist state and a nationalist community. So I want to start off by giving a quote by Napoleon, who, you know, we're not here to sing his praises, but it is an all right quote. And he says, "What is history but a fable agreed on?" And so here he's talking about the fact that history is a mere like fabrication. It's like interpreted in a certain way. Like, you know, none of us were there 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, or at the beginning of slavery. So what we know about it is what we have been told. And we need to ask ourselves, like, who is doing the telling and who is writing the history books? Who's typing the museum info cards? Who's appearing on our television screens telling us about this history and from what perspective? And it's the victor that tells the history. And even, you know, for example, events that happen within our lifetime that we don't have first-hand experience in, again, we're told by somebody else, and usually it is, again, by the victor. And so this subdues like historical account or current accounts of the oppressed within our public knowledge. And so I just want to give a quote by a lady called Jan Assmann, and she writes in an essay entitled Collective Memory and Cultural Identity, she writes that the supply of knowledge in the cultural memory is characterized by sharp distinctions made between those who belong and those who do not. So this goes back to what Aesop was saying, you know, she briefly mentioned Benedict Anderson and like the imagined community. So, you know, the imagined community is just basically the idea that a nation is a social construct. And so, you know, we need to ask ourselves, like, who fits into this community? Which stories matter within this community? And who is denied their place as a true citizen of their own country because their history does not fit into the accepted narrative?
Yep. So now I'm going to focus on education, and I'm going to try to answer the question, how is education such an important tool in reproducing white supremacy? So the first thing I want to talk about is language. So there's a man called Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who's a Kenyan author, and he writes about the tyranny of language. He talks about how Kikuyu people in a Kenyan context would be beaten into speaking English during British presence in Kenya. In his book, Decolonizing the Mind, he tries to figure out how the mental space of colonized people has been invaded, and he explores how language can be manipulated at the service of power. And so, you know, we see this on a global level in, you know, Africa speaking French and English. We see it everywhere. And so, you know, to give you an example, I know that in Lebanon, in some schools, people are still learning about our ancestors, the Gauls and the Franks. And there's no question, you know, there's no questioning of that. Why are we talking about, you know, I mean, it doesn't make any sense, you know, why is their ancestry not worth mentioning? And I think even in Europe, this is a reality, because if you look at how the Welsh were forced to speak English, there's literally torture weapons that were used against them in order to force them to speak English. Same for the Irish, they had clandestine schools to practice Gaelic. Same for in France, there's huge nationalist Breton movements to maintain and uphold the language. There's also Basque at the French-Spanish border. There's also Catalan. Also, I'm thinking of Italy. In Italy, you know, the Italian language was only formed in the 40s. Other than that, there's dialects all over the country. People in Sicily and in Tuscany don't understand each other if they talk their dialects, even now in 2020. So, you know, the imperial powers have annihilated everything around them and everything within them. They homogenized everything. And so this is really the idea that we've talked about in other seminars of there only being one truth. You know, we see this through language. And so now I want to move on to the idea of world maps. And so you may have seen this video of Jane Elliott recently that's been popping up. Personally, it's popped up loads of time in my feed in the last like 3 days. And it's a video where she compares the Mercator projection of the world, of, you know, the Mercator map, where generally Europe or North America is placed at the center and sizes are completely distorted. And because of the distortion, the way that it's designed, the importance and the size of the West is really, really quite strongly increased. And Canada is in reality much smaller than the maps than most of us, I presume, studied in school. And Africa is much larger than we think. Because Europe is right in the middle, it just seems like it's all the size of all of West Africa, but it's really not. It's just so much smaller. And this highly influences how we look at the world and the meaning that we give to it and what we give importance to. And essentially it reproduces and maintains white supremacy because it's, again, this idea that we are bigger, we are better, and we are more important. So there are alternatives. So in that video, Jane Elliott presents the Peters world map, which distorts shapes but not surface size, and so it's proportional to real life. And there on that map, Canada is so much smaller. Latin America is 9 times the size of Greenland. So it really, really contrasts a lot if you've never seen that map before. And there's also the upside down map, which just kind of tends to calls for like just another view of the world, you know. And now I kind of want to move on to the actual content that we learn in school. So I think across the Western world, we learn about, just because I can't speak for other places, but we learn about the discovery of America and Christopher Columbus discovering America. So obviously this is a complete erasure of indigenous people already being there. And it's also quite a literal one because, you know, there were sacred monuments there and Europeans arrived and put their churches and their cathedrals literally on these sacred monuments or sacred land, which further erases their culture, their presence, etc. And also the idea that we Westerners call that a discovery is quite interesting when you just think of the fact that there have always been migration patterns and that this is not, Christopher Columbus was not the first to go to what we now call the Americas. But I want to focus on France a little bit just because it's the only curriculum that I really went through, like in school, not in university. And so here, just like many other national curriculums, I'm sure history is told by mostly a white male perspective. We read a majority of white men. And so I'm thinking notably of, I just want to give 3 examples. So I'm thinking of Colbert, who was the author of the Code Noir. He's basically a French philosopher under Louis XIV, I believe. Don't quote me, but I think that's right. And he's glorified all over the country. Lisa and myself went to a school called Sciences Po where he was framed. And just for the record, the Code Noir is a set of laws that are really, really, really horribly racist. And they're kind of, you know, it's like, oh, if an enslaved person runs away, you can do this, 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 this. Like, I mean, it's really, really quite appalling. And yet he's glorified. And I personally didn't learn that in school. This is not a French context, but almost, I mean, it's Belgian. Leopold II is also someone who is revered in Belgium, and, you know, there's statues of him all over the place. He's arguably responsible, and I think rightly so, responsible for causing genocide, and he's responsible for brutal atrocities in the Congo. And then finally, Napoleon. I think there is a complete erasure of the fact that up until that in 1794, slavery was abolished in France, and that Napoleon was the one who reinstated it in 1802, and then it wasn't abolished until 1848. So I think in France, and perhaps more generally in Europe, or even just in the West, you studied the Holocaust and Second World War throughout the years, and there's a very strong emphasis on the duty of memory, and I think that's very important. However, when it comes to slavery, you only study 4 to 5 hours in middle school. So I think exactly normally when you're about 13 years old, and it's 4 to 5 hours, including the test. So I think that's only about like 4 hours or 3 hours of actual lecturing or learning. I was also reading when I was researching for this, and I found this article by a woman called Canel Fourdrinier, who, I don't know where this was. I think it must have been in the Antilles, in the French Caribbean, but she remembers doing a minute of silence for Schulcher, who's revered as the French abolitionist, but she never did any minutes of silence for any of the enslaved people of the islands. And then in my personal experience, I studied the Algerian War for a couple of hours with one teacher when I was about 14, and he was a teacher who really didn't follow the national curriculum. So it's not really, I think it's, you know, our French colonial and slaveholding history is not part of the school curriculum, or if it is, when it is, it's really, really minimized. And it's like, oh, look at, we abolished it, blah, 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 you know, it's completely biased. And so there's a lack of honesty regarding the past. It's as though racism is kind of just there. There's no teaching or learning of exactly how and when and by whom white supremacy was invented, why it's still real. And we know all of that, you know, we know it was invented in the 1600s for very specific purposes, which were to colonize and to enslave and to justify that colonialism and that enslavement. But yet France is incapable of owning up to that. And I don't think that France is alone in its amnesia, though it's a very, you know, it is really amnesic, I don't know how you say it. But yeah, now it's up to Lisa to talk to us about Britain's amnesia.
Yeah, so yeah, France is definitely not alone, and in the UK we have a similar structure. So Esau briefly mentioned how, you know, at school we learn a lot about the Holocaust, and obviously, you know, we need to know about the disgusting, like, horrific abuses at the hands of Nazi Germany on Jews or towards Jews. However, why do we learn that and not about the concentration camps at the hands of Britain itself? And so now I just want to talk about two examples of like British concentration camps in history. So the first one I'm going to look at is concentration camps in South Africa at the beginning of the 1900s, and then I'm going to move on to like concentration camps in Kenya in the mid 20th century. And so to start off with, so the first kind of concentration camps that happened, or that I'm going to be talking about anyway, happened within the Second Boer War in South Africa. So this was a war between 1899 and 1902. And just to give you a bit of context, the Boers were farmers, but they were also the original like Dutch settlers to South Africa in the 17th century. It wasn't until the beginning of the 19th century where Britain claimed South Africa, which was then known as Cape Colony, as one of their colonies. And so basically the Second Boer War started because although like Britain had colonized, the Boers still had like, you know, their territories or their little territories, and within their like area there was gold and diamonds. And so obviously Britain, being like the brutal imperialist that it is, you know, started a war to try and obtain this gold and these diamonds. And so during the war, Britain essentially cornered and pushed Boers, as well as Black people, into concentration camps surrounded by barbed wire. And so over 100,000 Boers alone were put into the camps. So there was 45 camps for Boers, and there was 64 camps for Black people. And a lot of people, you know, died from disease and malnutrition. So over 40,000 people combined, like Boers and Black people, died at this time. And so the man that's responsible for this is a man called Earl Kitchener. And, you know, just to give context, he is honoured in a swanky bronze statue in London. So this is one, a great example of historic erasure, but two, it brings us back to the conversation of statues, the fact that we venerate a man who has committed such atrocities. And so now I want to move on to the second example of concentration camps, and that is in Kenya in the mid-20th century. So between 1952 to 1960, there was a thing called the Kenya Mao Mao Uprising. And just to hammer this in, so this is after Britain condemned Nazi Germany for their atrocities against the Jews. So between 1952 and 1960, we had the Mao Mao Uprising. And basically the Mao Mao Uprising was just kind of a group of militant native Kenyans who were rebelling against British colonial rule. They were rebelling for, basic rights. And this was a very important milestone in the fight for Kenya's independence. However, during this, 1.5 million Kenyans were put in detention camps by the British. And in these camps, talking was forbidden, families were split up, diseases were rife, people died of starvations, Britain tortured people, and people were sexually assaulted as well at the hands of the British. As well as this, there was forced labor of the detainees. So many infrastructure projects in Kenya at the time were built on the back of these forced labor camps. And so this event is described in detail in Caroline Elkins' book entitled Britain's Gulag. And so Elkins estimates that up to Elkins estimates that up to 100,000 people died in these camps. We're unsure of the true number though, because the British government, as Elkins put it, was involved in a very highly choreographed, systematized process of destroying and removing documents so it could craft the official narrative that sits in these archives. So again, we need to ask ourselves, going back to what I said earlier, who tells the story, from what perspective, which history is worth our understanding, is worthy of our attention, and whose history is insignificant. It's also important to note that the Prime Minister at the time was Winston Churchill. So he was the Prime Minister at the start of the Mao Mao Uprising. And we know that Winston Churchill is a problematic figure, and at the moment especially, people are petitioning and trying to take the statue of him down because we venerate him in society as the greatest leader of all. He's an amazing war leader, even though he is arguably the epitome of racist imperialism. It's the stories that get told are as important as the stories that don't in creating this nationalist system and perpetuating white supremacy. And just to reinforce this cultural dictatorship, I just want to read a quote by the BBC, which was written in 2013 about the Mao Mao Uprising. The article goes, "The Mao Mao, a guerrilla group, began a violent campaign against white settlers in 1952, but the uprising was eventually put down by the British colonial government." So this was literally written 7 years ago, and through the way that they write this, there again, you can see that they're placing, this violent group, Britain thankfully put them down. And this is a good example of what Noam Chomsky talks about in his book, Manufacturing Consent. The fact that the media is literally just a propaganda machine. It is a tool to create or to perpetuate and to keep the social order which is white supremacist.
Yeah. So I'm now going to be talking about the whitewashing of abolition. And so going back to the presence of these statues and these monuments, the counter argument to taking them down is often that these monuments celebrate culture and they celebrate our heritage. So I'm just going to focus on the US South for a minute, just because it's the most obvious example. And so ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union, recently released a talk. I don't know if it's when it was, but no, I think it must have been in the last few weeks that they did it. So it's a talk on the taking down of this so-called heritage. And the speaker he goes through kind of the peaks in the setting up of these statues in the southern US. And so the first peak is in the first 20 years of the 20th century. So basically from 1901 to 1921, there's a peak in the construction of these statues, which is interesting because you'd presume, oh, you know, if there's a Confederate soldier up there, you'd presume that he was put up there around the 1860s, you know, but no. And I think there's one specific peak in 1921, which is exactly the same year as when the Tulsa massacre happened. 300 Black people were killed and were murdered. And so the reason why the speaker talks about the peaks in the building, like why he looks at when there was peaks in them being built, is because he's looking at what was going on politically in the United States when those statues were being set up. And he talks about his own hometown of Memphis, where there is a bust put up of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a slave trader who made a fortune from trading enslaved people. And he was also the original KKK Grand Wizard. And that bust was put up in 1970. So there's still a debate in the US South about the Confederacy and the meaning of the Confederate flag. And, you know, I just want to shut down the debate right here. You know, like they say it loud and clear, that flag stands for segregation. And if that bust was put up in 1970, we know why they put it up. And so refusing to acknowledge what the flag or what these statues mean in relation to when they were built and who the person was, and saying that it represents Southern pride or is your heritage is a lie. It's just a straight up lie. And so I think it's very important to bring up the US South because it's just such an obvious example. But I would like to bring the conversation back to France. So the academic Mabula Sumahoro, who is actually Lisa's former teacher, when we lived in France, she argued that American racism serves as a theoretical tool, quote, as a theoretical tool to avoid the French question of racism here. And I think this is really important because our politicians have often referenced and still do the warm welcome of African Americans, you know, in the early 20th century. So for example, Josephine Baker, or maybe at the end of the World Wars, the African American soldiers being welcomed in Paris, blah, blah, blah. So it's like we have the right to call them out for, so, you know, and even now, right now, we still hear this argument, which is we are not the United States. So when we talk about police brutality in France, people will say we're not the United States. And so, you know, we're very quick to, I've said this before in other seminars, but we're very quick to criticize the United States, but we are incapable of acknowledging that their racism was invented here and that this is a part of our story too, you know? And so in the Antilles, which is territory in the Caribbean, which is French, which is where most of French slave trading went on. I mean, they were French colonies, basically, these islands. So in the Antilles, there are streets, schools, buildings, and even cities who wear the name of a man called Churchill. That man is the man who, on paper, abolished slavery. The thing is, there were Black people who were enslaved who pushed for him to, like, they left him no choice but for him to have to sign abolition. And so there's a distortion. In fact, you know, it's denying and lying about France's role in that history. And so the emphasis that is placed on Churchill, who is really, like, when you learn about abolition in France, that's who you learn about. The emphasis on him and not on anyone else, it really invisibilizes the enslaved people who fought for their freedom for centuries. And so where are the Black and brown abolitionists, who are multiple? And where are, for example, the Haitians, who were the first to declare their republic, their independent republic of formerly enslaved people? And that is a really important part of French history of abolition. So in a lot of these territories that enslaved people were deported to, if they obtained their freedom, it was through fighting us, and it was their rebellions and their uprisings that forced Western politicians to have no choice but to abolish slavery. And so all these lies, all this bullshit it's all to maintain and uphold the idea of the nation and this narrative of nationalism, which is the idea that the French government, the French state, is one of the leaders in the fight against racism, which is just not true. And so now I want to bring this back to the present. I want to bring this back to last Sunday, exactly, when Macron had a speech concerning the current context. So first of all, the speech was about what's going on with COVID here. And so here in France, just in case you don't know, there has been, of course, it's been kind of blown up since George Floyd's death, but there's been a lot of protests around police brutality and just systemic racism here. And as I said, the reaction in France is often kind of one of, we are not the United States. So in Macron's speech, I just want to mention the fact that he didn't mention police brutality. But however, what he did say was France will take a strong position against racism, while simultaneously saying that he condemned and refused the removal of destruction of any statue, refusing the revision of history, and saying that France will not erase any name or remove any statue from its cultural heritage. So I know we have a very different history to the United States. However, this is the same discourse as I was talking about in the US South. It's exactly the same rhetoric. And Macron actually even tweeted that, so there were people in Martinique who, so this is a present colony, I mean, it's where a lot of the plantations were, the French plantations were. So some people in Martinique destroyed a statue of Schœlcher, and Macron tweeted that they're dirtying the French heritage. But in fact, it's the French heritage that's dirty, and they're cleaning it and reappropriating it themselves. So according to Françoise Vergès, who I've spoken about in the past, she's a decolonial feminist thinker. She's also the president of the association Decolonize the Arts. She argues that undoing these statues is less about removing history or revising it and more about justice. And it's about questioning, the reason why we have war criminals on literal pedestals everywhere in our cities and all across the globe, And she argues that these are not history, they're memory. And so they're political choices. Governments have paid for those statues to be made and to be put there, They didn't just appear. And as we saw, they appeared sometimes much later than we think. And so also just to bring back to, just kind of, there's something ironic here, which is that, the Romans toppled statues. I'm sure many, many, many other peoples toppled and destroyed statues. In France, how many cathedrals do we have which have, headless characters all over them? I mean, we even decapitated our own monarchs. So it's not like we don't understand the power of symbols and the symbolism of statues. And, first of all, ending racism shouldn't be a conversation. It's not, it's not a debate. And so if Macron claims to be anti-racist, his firm refusal to engage in even a conversation about France's colonialist and slaveholding past is a complete refusal to acknowledge that past, and thus is inherently racist. And this demanding of taking down these statues, and it goes hand in hand with the shift that is going on right now, with people calling out the police, people asking to decolonize curriculums, to decolonize, defund carceral systems and the police, and sometimes they even call for abolishing it, and people calling for decolonizing our cities.
Yeah, so obviously Isolde spoke from a French context, but I feel like there's so much crossover there. We could just, take a lot of that and apply it to the UK as well, because we really are like very, very similar. But now I'm going to talk about the UK response specifically, and I also want to talk about the question of reparations. So, Isolde kind of mentioned this, but taking down statues is one form of justice for the oppressed. It's physically and metaphorically shedding a part of our traumatic history and pushing the power of our stories back into the public narrative. Stories that have been hidden from the nation for centuries, and arguably from the world for centuries, through calculated cultural cleansing that we have spoken about like all through this seminar. However, solely taking down a statue is not enough. Black people need reparations. White Europe is indebted to Black, Brown, and Indigenous people across the globe. So I want to give a quote by Frantz Fanon in his book, Wretched of the Earth, which I highly recommend. And he basically says that colonialism and imperialism have not settled their debt to us once they have withdrawn from our territories. The wealth of the imperialist nations is also our wealth. Europe is literally the creation of the third world. He's saying that Britain, the US, and Western Europe are literally built on slavery. In our climate justice seminar, we talked about the relationship between capitalism, but between industrial revolution as well, which is arguably, one of the pinnacle of kind of like, or the birth of this real like current capitalist economy we live in. I guess a milestone of the current capitalist economy that we live in, and something that we take such pride in as Britons, like, the Industrial Revolution was, such an amazing thing, and like Crystal Palace and all of this kind of stuff. But we need to acknowledge that that would not be possible without slavery. We would have no Industrial Revolution without going and stealing people from their country and then forcing them to work on land that was stolen from Indigenous people. But generally the wealth of the nation lies on the backs of slaves and colonized people. For example, such as institutions such as the Bank of England, RBS, Barclays, Lloyds, and the Royal Mail, as well as many, many, many others, flourished at the hands of slavery, subsequently feeding cultural institutions such as the National Gallery, the Royal Academy, the Tate, the V&A, and the British Museum. And I'm going to include in like our resources sheet a link to a database by UCL's Centre for the Study of Slave Legacies of British Slave Ownership. It basically lists like many, many British institutions which were, flourished or were really formed like through slavery. And we can also talk about universities that were bolstered up during this time. For example, Bristol Uni was founded, the money that was used to found Bristol University, 85% of it was made from slavery. So this is why we say that the money is owed. Britain would not be standing as it is without Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. It's important to note that Jewish people have received reparations for the atrocities that they suffered under Nazi Germany, but still we continue to demand reparations for slavery and colonialism. And yes, we can look at the recent backing of Rhodes Must Fall by an Oxford college, as maybe like a bit of progression, but really, it's more of a symbol, and like we need to ask, what is the government actually doing? And I just want to kind of go back to what I was talking about in a previous section when I was talking about the Mao Mao Uprising. And so it's interesting to note that in 2009, a case was brought against the British government for the war crimes, during this Mao Mao Uprising. And so the UK initially threw the case out, saying that, too much time has elapsed. And they basically argued that when Kenya became independent, so when power switched from, Britain into the Kenyan Republic, that the war crimes were transferred like to the Republic as well, which is obviously a ridiculous argument, but they use this to suggest that they could not be legally liable. And so it wasn't until 2013 when Britain were forced, as a result of this case, were forced to pay £20 million to over 5,000 Kenyans. And this is significant because it's the first and perhaps only time in British history that the victims of colonialism received compensation. However, you know, we might say, oh, £20 million, that's so amazing. But really, you know, it should be more, because, you know, if we think about, for example, the 1.5 million people who were detained in camps, you know, £20 million is not enough. If we think about the history of colonialism in Kenya and just around Africa and around the world, you know, more needs to be done. And so within this specific example, in 2016, for example, a group of Mao Mao veterans demanded that Britain pay £4 trillion for them because of Britain's colonization of Kenya. I want to also talk about in 2015, when David Cameron visited Jamaica, was on a tour of Jamaica, and in Jamaican Parliament, he basically said that we all need to move on from slavery, which kind of, you know, reflects the whole sentiment during this Mao Mao case, where they said, you know, too much time has elapsed, it's not relevant. But, you know, David Cameron, being, I don't know, the supposed nice person, but more like delusional, a person that he is, said, okay, I'm going to help out, and I'm going to pledge £25 million to Jamaican prisons to help you guys out. But obviously this is extremely problematic for a few reasons. The first reason being that literally the creation of the British prison can be traced back to Jamaica. Arguably the first prison created by the British was in Jamaica, and it was used to control and subjugate slaves. That's why it's controversial, number one. But number two, when he gave this money, he said that the agreement would mean that Jamaican criminals are sent back home to serve their sentences, saving the British taxpayer millions of pounds, but still ensuring justice is done. So it's not even a question of helping them. It's the question of deporting these people from our countries back to their home country because, you know, it's costing us too much to go back home. So really, it's not even a reparation. So obviously this was in 2015 under a different leader, but the same government. But I would argue that there is still a massive inefficiency in dealing with the problem. So instead of implementing change at this time, the UK government last week proposed an update on legislation of the Desecration of War Memorials Bill. And so this update means that now people who deface memorials can face up to 10 years in prison. This new legislation was backed by 125 Conservatives, as well as Labour leader Keir Starmer. And obviously creating or updating or enforcing this legislation rather at this time where, you know, Black people are fighting for recognition, and, you know, there's so many petitions out there trying to topple statues, and this is, you know, a mode of justice for them. Obviously this legislation just acts to vilify them and acts to silence them, which is crazy considering that they are fighting to they're fighting like the silent Black people are fighting the silence that the government has like placed on them and their history, and through this they're again being silenced and being vilified and being criminalized. As well as this, Boris Johnson has set up a new government commission which looks into racism in our society. However, the person that he's put in charge of this commission is a lady named Munira Mirza, and so she is highly problematic. And despite being a Muslim woman herself with Pakistani parents, she actually went to defend Boris Johnson when he said that Muslim women are reminiscent of like letterboxes and bank robbers. And she basically said that, oh, you know, people are being hysterical. She also said that structural racism is more of a perception than a reality. So the person that is chairing a commission to look into institutional racism is a lady that herself, she doesn't even believe in institutional racism. It's interesting because at a Black Lives Matter protest in London yesterday, crowds can be heard and seen chanting, Munira Mirza must go. This just goes to show that Britain really needs to step its game up. It needs to acknowledge its history in order to move towards an anti-racist future, which it currently is not doing.
Yeah, amen. So in the 50s and 60s, during the Cold War, African countries called the UN to accompany the UN accompanied a lot of African countries and others to in the process of decolonizing, like formal decolonization. And so the UN had this whole anti-racist rhetoric going on at the time, and I'm bringing it up because on Monday or Tuesday, the head commissioner of the UN for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, who used to be she's the former Chilean president, she addressed the UN Council and talked about countries having to officially, publicly apologize for past and present wrongs. And she also talked about reparations. She talked about decolonizing curriculums, removing statues, returning stolen artifacts. So this is quite a radical speech for the UN. And I think it's very interesting because there's a very strong dichotomy between the UN's position, or in other words, the international community's position, and the French state's position, or the British state's position, as Lisa and myself have just tried to kind of explain. So what's very interesting here is that the UN is claiming, they're taking a stronger than Macron, they're taking a stronger than British or French anti-racist stance. However, they're incapable of sanctioning or doing anything to the states who were largely responsible for racism. So we'll see if they do something for the United States concerning human rights abuses. It's possible, but even just for the record, I wasn't supposed to say this, but even just for the record, the Human Rights Watch has just condemned France for police brutality, and our president doesn't even want to put those two words together. So, I doubt the UN is going to be able to do anything, but I'm just putting it out there. And so despite widespread decolonization of most former colonies in the 20th century, Western hierarchical systems of power and forms of knowledge production still predominate. And so there's something called coloniality, or which the Gurminder Bamra calls epistemological dominance, which is basically the dominance of the West in ways of thinking and forms of knowledge production. The West continues to subjugate the rest of the world to our hegemony, and so formal decolonization, which is the end of territorial domination, it's the giving of independence, supposedly resulted in the beginning of the post-colonial world order. But the thing is, decolonial thinkers argue that the concept of coloniality did not disappear with decolonization, and decoloniality is different to decolonization. The legacies of colonialism in our minds, the legacies of colonialism are embedded in our minds, in our forms of knowledge production, and in our global power structures. And and earlier I was talking about a man called Ernest Gellner, when I was talking about nationalism, and so he talks about high culture, which is written, versus low culture, which is mostly oral or spoken. And in the West, we tend to dismiss and undermine non-written traditions such as either dancing or storytelling or singing or whatever it may be, and consider our forms of knowledge production better and more civilized. And that's why we've imposed them on everyone, because we do consider them to be, that's white supremacy, really. And so this erasure of all non-written forms of knowledge is fundamentally violent and serves to reproduce Western epistemological hegemony, so the hegemony of Western knowledge. And so coloniality was not only implemented in our minds, it was also practically carried out, for example, in our school curriculums, as we've tried to show, but also, you know, we see it in our statues. And so what decolonialism calls for is a delinking, or like an undoing or a deconstruction of that coloniality. And, you know, they call for an undoing of what they call the modernity rationality paradigm, the idea that everything which is modern is rational. And, you know, that is very, I recommend looking at our first seminar in order to kind of go further on that, or looking at the resources that we'll send after the seminar. I'll put all these decolonial thinkers in. And so according to Gurminder Bhamra, decolonial thought aims to consider non-Western thought to be integral to changing and shifting these narratives of modernity and transforming them into something that, you know, that will include everyone and that isn't going back, it's a going forwards. You know, taking down these statues isn't going back, it's moving towards a future where everyone has a voice, basically. And so for Walter Mignolo, who's another thinker, he argues that decolonialism is the deconstruction of the, quote, colonial matrix of power. And so I think the reason why I'm talking so much about what decolonial thinkers have put forward is because removing these statues is quite literally an undoing and a delinking and, you know, a deconstruction of a very clear form of coloniality which has taken up our minds, our debates, our spaces, and our knowledge.
Yeah, we've basically kind of gone through the topic. I just want to end with this quote, and then obviously we'll be opening up the discussion. So this quote is from a French philosopher called Halbach, and it's cited in Jan Assmann's essay that I referenced earlier. And it basically says, "No memory can preserve the past. What remains is only that which society in each era can reconstruct within its contemporary frame of reference." So I think this is a good, you know, thought to end with, because it highlights kind of the inaccuracy or of the past and like the injustice of the past. But it can also, this quote can also be used in order to kind of establish optimism of the future, like a new retelling of history for the future to come. So yeah, that's everything we've prepared. So we just want to open up the conversation and ask you guys, you know, what do you think about the removing of statues? What do you think about, I guess, white supremacy as a global culture, really? Yeah, I mean, we've got different people from different places, so it might be an interesting topic. Yeah. So if anyone wants to speak, now is your time. Or you can write in the chat as well.
We just all put our mics on and do a round of applause for...
Thank you, Evan.
Thank you.
Yeah, Lisa, when you were talking about the Mao Mao uprisings in Kenya, Ellie wrote in the chat, "Wow, I learned about the Mao Mao uprisings at A level and they failed to mention the British concentration camps." It's quite interesting because that feeds exactly into what you were saying about it being erased from the national narrative.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well because as I was researching like the Mao Mao uprising, when they talk about the concentration camps, they often talk about the Boers that were put into the concentration camps as opposed to Black people that were. So like within a lot of the articles, it showed how many Boers. Like for example, I can say that there was around 100,000 Boers that were put into the camps, but I couldn't find a number for the amount of Black people, which, you know, again highlights the shifts, you know, to white lives. But obviously both were completely atrocious on both counts. Yeah.
Lisa, so I went to the same school as Lisa, and I don't know if you can remember learning anything, because I don't remember anything about slavery or anything even mildly about race. Do you remember learning anything like that when we were at school?
No, like I literally try and think about this and like I can't remember at all. I remember You might have been in this class as well, but I think it was like an A-level, or it might have been like GCSE English, or maybe A-level English, and we were reading like The Home Place, and basically the teacher was talking about how like one of the themes is kind of like colonialism. It's like an Irish book, and she was
What was
talking about colonialism. Was it The Home Place? Yeah, I think it was.
I'm not sure. I can't remember. I'll have to think about that.
And she basically said something, I think it might have been Miss Beaton, but I'm not really sure, but basically she said something like, oh, you know, one of the themes is just showing how bad like the atrocities of like the British like colonial empire. And when she said that, I was just like, what? Like, I thought the empire was amazing, like, what?
Yeah.
But honestly, I don't remember learning about slavery at all. I think
no, I remember this idea that the kind of idea that I feel like I gathered was that slavery happened, and then we saw the error of our ways and we fixed it, and now racism is a thing of the past, and that's kind of the message I remember getting.
Yeah.
But I don't think we'd really talked about it at school.
And World War II was just kind of nudged in there, just sort of happened out of the blue.
Yeah. What I was thinking, I remember doing for A-level history from 1906 to 1952, which I'm guessing is the period of the Mao Mao Uprising was in that. But I don't remember anything about it, or even any idea that Churchill wasn't this like sad guy. Like, I don't remember it at all.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and like relating it, I didn't do history A-level, but I did history GCSE, and I do remember learning about Jim Crow laws and segregation of like the US South. And I remember, I can't remember what the teacher was called, but I remember that she was kind of talking about how this was so atrocious, and, you know, she was condemning the US, like, oh, how can these people do this? But never did she mention at all like the UK's role in that. And it's just like so interesting. And also as well, when you do like learn about slavery, probably for like the little that you do, like you hear names such as like William Wilberforce and, you know, white abolitionists, but there are, for example, like Aluda Equiano, who is like a black abolitionist like within the UK. We don't hear his name. You know, we hear that the white man saved like everybody from slavery, but arguably as well within that narrative, we can argue that William Wilberforce and his approach to slavery, we could argue was on an economic basis. And if we want to look at white abolitionists, we can say that women, although they can be problematic because we could say maybe they were being a bit maternalistic, seeing slaves as like children, but it was the women who actually campaigned for immediate abolition of slavery. And without them, we wouldn't have perhaps like the abolition of like slavery altogether when it happened so early. But we don't really mention that. We mention white males, and no.
I think that's really dangerous, actually, that you only hear about, you know, the people that abolished slavery being white men and people introducing reform being white men, but actually it kind of fails to mention the protests and the revolution that comes from the bottom up. And it's kind of dangerous because it makes us think that, oh, things change because the white rich men in charge decide to be better, when actually the power is in the hands of the people.
Yeah. Well, surely it's the opposite of dangerous in the sense that it's inherently protective to the social norm, to the establishment. I think that's what I've thought about the statues and stuff like that. Is we're talking about bringing the statues down and revisiting our culture and questioning, you know, all like this white supremacy that's embedded within our society. But we're asking that of people whose interest it is to maintain that white supremacy, and also to as you said, to any change, they seek to rehabilitate that change within the establishment structure of saying, oh, well, it was the establishment who saw the error of their ways and then changed. Because actually, if you really question all those structures, you're questioning the existence of those people who are in power, and they want to stay in power.
Yeah, and I think going back to what you were saying, Ellie, it makes us underestimate the power of protests. And when you look at the United States in the last like 4 weeks, protests have brought us really, really far. Loads of things have been achieved. Minneapolis is like abolishing, or at least I think they're defunding their police. I mean, that is change. That is real change. And so, yeah, as you're saying, Evan, it's in their interest to keep us not protesting, basically. But also Harvey said in the comments, how can we pay the true amounts of reparations to African countries while we still take billions from them every year? How do we end neo-imperialism? Does anybody have the answer to that?
Oh, I might have an example for that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So basically, like a week ago, there was like this kind of like a big controversy in Tunisia, because like the parliament wanted to pass some sort of like, not law, but like some sort of like, yeah, you can call law, like in which they want like France to apologize for for colonialism there. But then this suggestion did not pass because like the party who was like proposing was kind of just like a populist move, and like it didn't have anything substantial for it like to be more or less like voted upon. But like also this brings us like, because like there was like this whole 1 week of like very heated discussions, because like there were like a lot of people saying we don't want, like it doesn't mean anything to have an apology from France. And this is kind of like brought me into exactly like what colonialism have made of like people, which is like basically that we have now this like internalized colonized like subjectivity, which is basically says that, well, what happens is in the past is the past, and then for example they ignore the fact that like 1 day before like France signed like the independence like declaration, they actually also signed like a 25% like debt like more to Tunisia, like because they knew they were leaving, and like we're still paying that, and they still like, so it's just like at some point like I got so frustrated, because of course like you say, yeah, we don't want to ruin like relationship with France because it's our first like trade partner and we rely on it on many things, and we have like so many immigrants there, blah blah blah. So yeah, just like leave it as it is. And plus like Macron has once like mentioned this somewhere in his electoral like campaign that like colonization is bad, and I'm like oops, hello, a bit late to the party, but okay. But yeah, it just like kept me thinking that actually like at the end of the day it really like takes a lot of like for example like the other thing that was like really also discussed the whole time is that we don't have the archives from like the period where like France decolonized Tunisia, which is basically we don't even know like the whole truth, and like all this archive is somewhere like in France and Paris, and we don't have access to it, which is basically means that you're stealing like part of history of one country and then denying it's like the access to it. And it's just like it's just like people really underestimate colonialism because they think it's over, and they don't really get what post-colonialism is, which is like exactly what I understood like that last week, because like they really don't know. And once we have to start talking about things that like this that was like very NGO was like very involved in this, started talking about, hey, that was like the step, and like nobody knew about it because of course like it's not in the archives that we have. And it's just like there's a lot of like history and like truth, like for example like the forest that you have talked about, Lisa, I was like what the fuck, to see the example that you talked about, like wow, this is how bad it is. And like people go out and it's just like internalized, and they don't want to question it, because if they question it they feel like they're going to lose even more, and that's exactly what's very painful here. Yeah,
and I think it's interesting what you're saying about how people don't know about post-colonialism, and it's kind of reminiscent of how we say like slavery is over, so racism is non-existent. Colonialism, like official colonialism, is over, so there's nothing there anymore. We don't need to worry about that problem. But if we look at the African continent today, we look at how British companies, for example, again I'm going to quote Zambia because I know about that, but we look at the copper belt in Zambia, where literally British companies are just taking all of the money, and they're actually committing arguably like crimes by polluting the humanitarian crimes by polluting the water, and cases have been taken one to the UK Supreme Court because of like the abuses of these like UK companies. But again, within Africa, we can talk about like new Chinese like colonialism, and the fact that I think it's a really interesting question that you posed, Harvey, because essentially if you gave like a lot of money to kind of to these African countries or to like former colonies around the world, then if they're still colonizing, then it doesn't really make up for anything. Like arguably if we want to like bring it down to that, like colonialism or capitalism is inherently tied to colonialism, is inherently tied to racism. So the only way we can stop such imperialism is to break that capitalist structure that we have, and without breaking it, we're not ever going to achieve an equality, and we're never going to achieve like real reparations. But obviously, yeah.
I mean, I had like also like a class last week, like you would have really went nuts if you attended that class. There was like some sort of like geopolitics class, and they were trying to understand like like the new role of Europe and China in Africa. And then like there was like this guy who was also supposed to be like some sort of like representative for the EU. And then he was something saying like, I don't know what's wrong with like African like countries. They just like, since decolonialism, they still cannot make it. And like literally no word about like, colonialism. And then there was like me and other also happens to be a Black student who actually said like, what the fuck, like seriously, you cannot just like give like a course on geopolitics and not mention how the conflicts, because they really love talking about the conflicts, which are really a result of like how colonial powers have divided Africa. And he's just like, and then he was saying something, but we have like development aid, and that was like for me like literally, then I just like went out of like the Zoom meeting. I was like, I'm not gonna take any shit from this. Literally, you have nothing to teach me here. And I think I said my point and then like the point is like when I was like trying to argue back at this, like he made me like when they use this card of like making you look like extra emotional and irrational, and then you being just like the lefty that and then he was using that card like against me, and I'm like, because like nobody, they were like all students, master students, like I don't know why nobody but me and the other like guy spoke up against it. But then it's also like says a lot on how teaching is very like even like he was trying to be like the nice guy. He was like yeah, but like I also have like Arab friends who are really like nice, like this is like it was getting worse and worse. And this is like when I realized that like how entrenched this kind of discourse that makes it okay to say, hey, we're giving Africa aid, so we did our part, we colonized, and then we just like now giving them aid, so they should be thankful and just like work on their like shit together. And I'm like, this is like this is exactly why you're working at the EU right now and giving me this lecture. Like this is exactly like this explains everything. I just like wanted to link that back to the like whole like aid myth that they love to just like throw around.
Yeah. And for Harvey has just added, in 2015 alone, 150 billion was given to Africa, and 200 billion was taken. And that's really interesting when you know that, I can't remember the figure of the amount of aid that goes to Africa worldwide. I can't remember how much it is, but the remittances, so people of like Afro-descendants, like just the African diaspora sending money back home. Actually, it's not only Africans. I think it's just generally migrants sending home. That like the figure is 300 billion pounds, I think. And so it's just kind of, and it's much smaller than what Oxfam gives or what States gives. And so individuals who work are the ones that are actually giving money that people are actually going to see.
It kind of like reminds me a bit of like the welfare reliance that the Tory government kind of created in the country, where they, instead of tackling the problems at the source, they've just kind of given aid, given out welfare without actually allowing people to recover, and introducing policies that will enable them to earn a living, find a job, or like introduce jobs to the area. It kind of creates this reliance on the power, the people in charge, as opposed to the people being able to take charge of their own lives and their own economies.
Yeah, it's like that quote that you like to share, Lisa, where it's Lyndon B. Johnson's quote, where he says, you know, what is the quote already?
It's something like, you know, you can't put two people at the beginning of a race, one of them is shackled, and expect them to both run like and complete the race at the same time.
Exactly. It's just, but it's the question of reparations, you know. It's like, well, I mean, how can I mean, it's so ironic. It's literally, we sign a paper, oh, slavery is abolished, now sort your shit out, you have to be equal to us. Oh, we've just exploited like all the resources out of like sub-Saharan Africa, now, you know, participate in our liberal economy where there are no rules. And it's just like, it's, yeah. We need to talk about reparations.
And you mentioned the Lyndon B. Johnson quote just then. I thought you were going to talk about the other one that he said about how he said that you should tell the lowest white man that he is above the highest black man, and therefore he'll never understand that you're picking his pocket. And I think looking at what's happened in the UK in the past, I think sort of in the past sort of 5 years or so, like I'm sort of seeing now that there's overlapping things going on, in the sense that we've got, across the board, we've got like a breakdown of the social contract, and you've got like austerity has hit loads of people really hard, and yet now you've got it's getting turned into a culture war, and it's just ironic to me that you've got people who are also being ripped off by the Tory government, you know, like a sort of like a working class white majority, are seeing themselves as under attack by other narratives like this. And it's like, it's classic misdirection, because it's like, do you not see that, you know, you are being exploited in different ways, and yet now it's being like Johnson is quite happy to turn it into a culture war of, you know, this is an attack on British culture. I mean, what the fuck even is British culture? I think if anyone can tell me what it is, like, I'd be happy to know. But yeah, so no, it's just maddening at the moment.
It's that classic thing where, you know, working class white people love the Conservatives because they're all about hard work, and if there's a Labour government, you're gonna like take benefits for the rest of your life and do nothing. But that government is the government who wants to harm you. It doesn't make no sense. And it's like this constant thing you hear, like, when you get older, you won't be left wing anymore. You'll be super right wing. It's just the progression. And it's such a strange thing where you just can't see past what is impacting you badly. It doesn't make sense to me.
And these sort of like, because it's like that, you know, they're capitalist and they're nationalist, and like all of these narratives, like, are basically just, you know, in 2020 working to reproduce this shit that has been going on for centuries, you know. And like, even now I'm sort of seeing it that, you know, in politics, and, you know, I'm sort of like a trainee journalist, and you see it in the media as well, because our centre is shifted to the right. It's almost like you have to slightly pander to people's fragility, and you almost have to slightly defend supremacy in its subtle forms to be considered neutral anymore. And that's what's really scary to me, is like, we're now in a situation where, you know, as you said, it's not a debate. You know, racism is not a debate, and the statues thing is such a straw man of like, no one is saying that British culture is under attack. We just don't want fucking slavers and imperialists championed in our city centres when these other narratives have been completely made invisible.
Yeah,
I've seen people talk about white pride, and like, what is that? That really horrifies me. My friend sent me, honestly, it's one of the most racist things I've ever seen, and it was talking about white pride and how they don't want to feel condemned for their race, and how unless you say, if you say that you're white, it's literally, just doesn't make any sense. It's just horrifying.
When you live in a white supremacist society, though, like, you don't see your, like, I think that's the crazy thing, is like, because it's a white dominated society, the visibility of whiteness as is deeply unsettling because people are used to just it being taken for granted. But yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, sorry, I saw that, I didn't even know this was a feature, but I saw, Harvey, that you put like a blue hand. I don't know if that means that you wanted to speak. I just noticed that as like a feature on Zoom.
I was going to say, like, I think racism's always been like a bit of a tool to try and like divide up, working class communities. That's like literally almost why it was invented and like why it's so propagated in America, especially during like the early 20th century, because that's one of the reasons why America never had like the surging trade union movement we saw in like the England and a lot of Europe, because they used a hell of a lot of racist rhetoric to divide white and black communities, meaning that any trade union was fundamentally undermined because it controlled, it didn't actually have that many workers per, it was either a white trade union or a black trade union, and they could never actually work together to actually achieve any solid demands like they could in Europe. And I think we're seeing that very similar type thing today with like these kind of like culture wars and trying to divide these kind of communities and stuff like that instead of an actual economic basis. And like we're seeing the foundations of that being laid down for future racism, even by like supposedly like woke companies like Amazon is literally like tracking how diverse a workplace is, like how many different people's racial people there are in like a workplace or whatever, and then using how high that diversity is to rate whether there's a risk of unionization, which even if that's not racist in itself, which I think it is, it means that in future they're going to be incentivized to try and make a divide between white and black workers in order to increase that division and make unionization harder and make actual struggle harder, which would allow for actual real change, I think.
Yeah, that's crazy. I'd never heard of that before, but that's just clearly racist, I would say. Does anyone want to speak?
Yeah, does anybody have anything else to add? Oh yeah, otherwise, actually, I was going to say earlier when somebody was mentioning, people feeling like they have to apologize for being white and all that. I really feel like, so we had a French politician recently who's like infamously fascist. There's no other word. Her dad is a fascist too. Like they're famous for that. And she published a video recently where she was saying about police brutality, not even about statues, where she was saying, "Oh, I'm not going to apologize for being white." And like, to be honest, if somebody goes into a conversation with that, I don't think they're worth anyone's time. But also, like, I like, for someone like that, she's an educated woman, and I'm kind of just like, this is 100% intentional. If there's somebody who's, if it's more coming up as kind of a white fragile kind of, oh, I'm not going to apologize for being white, and it's somebody who's clearly never ever thought of race before in their life, personally, I'd kind of tackle it. I would try to put in the emotional labor and kind of just be like, listen, this is how the system works. But with someone like that who's intentionally being ignorant, there's no excuse.
Yes, I agree. Just sorry to cut you off. It's the funniest thing. So,
We can't hear you very well.
essay.
The mic is a little off.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So in about 2015, I moved to SA, right? And then, mind you, I lived in Zambia, so I was in there. I'm just a Zambian man. I'm not a black Zambian man, which is fine. So when we went to, I think there's a subject called ELO, which is like life orientation, right? And then we were having this discussion about like history, and then I don't know, like there's a select room for ignorant people, because it's like when it's coming up, but you just don't know when to say it. So like we're having this whole discussion like history, and then specifically we're speaking about like South African history. So now the race is white. This one lady, her name was Michaela. So she goes, but I'm just saying, like, not all white people benefit from racism. So I was like, oh, okay. Okay. I said, okay. Because it's like when we asked the question, we broke it down. So we were like, okay, why do you say that? It was like, no, because I have a friend who lives down the road from me, and she goes to a private school and things like that. I was like, okay, cool, but your friend is not the spokesman for all of us here. How much money must parents spend to get to your school? So like, it's like this thing of, even I think you guys have spoken about this here. It's like the bare minimum of research is not done in certain cases, because that thought process could have been just debunked if you just searched up history, because South Africa's independence is 1994. It's very recent. So it's like you can just research it. And the other one that confuses me is the I don't see color thing, the I don't see color phrase. That one is the funniest. It's the funniest conversation you ever have, because you literally sit there and you be like, yeah, we're like, okay, so what's your opinion on the riots and the looting and things like that? What's your opinion on George Floyd's death, Ahmaud Damir's death, Breonna Taylor's death? And you'd be like, okay, cool. But then someone would be like, no, but you see, I don't see color, because I don't see color. To me, you're just another person. You're not white or black. You're just your hair, and it's like, okay, cool. The thing is, I don't see color means that you don't see, for example, you don't see mass incarceration of black men in America. You don't see the difference in wage gaps between black and white people in America, or the best one, you don't like. The best one is the colonization benefited everyone. That's the best one, because people will say, for example, I was having this conversation back home when I went to Zambia. A friend of mine was like, no, but it's not the same colonization in that Portugal, like the Leopold situation that Portuguese colonies had. And it's like, you cannot compare someone being thrown in a tiger's den and someone being thrown in an elephant's den. Of course, the tiger's going to eat you because it eats meat, but there are different effects that happen, if that makes sense.
Yeah, 100%. Like the whole colorblind thing, like to start off with, is just so like counterproductive. But the thing is, people think that it's actually like racially progressive. They think that by saying I don't see color, they've just solved the whole problem of racism. You know, they've just completely abolished racism, which is ridiculous. But yeah, like the colonial kind of argument as well, you know, I think that's still very present today, even in the UK. So I was writing an article this morning, and I was writing about how a third of people in the UK believed that the empire was a good thing. And I think around 40% of them were unsure. And then there was 27% of British people. So this study was done last year. So there's 27% of British people who want the empire back. And, you know, it's just crazy, because you get taught, you know, we built roads, we built like hospitals, you know, we built schools and all of this, but, you know, they don't realize the atrocities that went on, for example, as I talked about in like the concentration camps and so on and so forth.
With those concentration camps, I'd like to kind of specify, I was studying the British Empire at A-level history, and they didn't mention that. And one of the essay questions we had to answer was the British Empire a force for good? And you could get the same marks answering yes as you could no. And I think the way that it's taught was, I'm lucky that I had a really good teacher and, you know, an anti-racist teacher, but it was really uncomfortable learning some of the things and the tone that you learned it with. You could just tell that it was something that people, even when they knew the atrocities, were still proud of. So, yeah.
Yeah. Cassie's written, I've heard that rhetoric so often recently, I found myself having to explain a lot to my working class family how our being working class doesn't mean we're not privileged by being white. Yeah, I think this is very real. I think this goes back to something that we were saying in our first seminar, is the fact that people don't really, and it goes back to the colorblindness thing too, it's the fact that people don't understand, or perhaps choose not to see, that racism is much more than just the KKK. Obviously the KKK is the KKK, but you know, it's kind of only the tip of the iceberg. much broader. The most harmful part, I guess, of racism is the systemic aspect of it. And people. The thing with white supremacy is that white people get defensive when we're called white, but it's also related to like so many other things. We get defensive when we're called white because we're used to being individuals, and we have no problem calling other people black and taking away their individuality. But when ours is taken away, that's a big issue for us. It's not fun not being an individual anymore. So yeah, it's complicated, and I think it's really related to that colorblindness issue. It's people think like and then colorblindness becomes really dangerous when it's no longer an individual saying that they don't see race, which is just stupid. I mean, of course you see race, you're taught to see race. But when governments like the French government, who removed the word race out of our constitution in 2018, and so it means that, I mean, we can do some statistics based on race or ethnicity or origin, but it's very complicated. And it's just kind of like, look, we've removed racism from our constitution, so racism doesn't exist here. And it's just like, that doesn't work. That just doesn't work. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, I kind of just wanted to, I was sort of chatting to my mate about it today, about, yeah, I definitely think that, I mean, do you remember that class when we were talking about Fanon and the idea of mirroring, and how that Fanon only, he had that account of when he said that he went to France the first time and first realised himself.
The train?
Yeah, on the train with a child pointing at him. And I kind of see the inverse happening now in this kind of existential crisis that we're having in Britain and Western countries when confronted with the uncomfortable realities of racism, of white supremacy, of colonialism. I do honestly think that, because this culture, like, as I said, I have no fucking clue what British culture is. It's so diffuse. So these statues or the empire or any of this shit, like, as a white person, that stuff has sat unproblematically, comfortably with me because it hasn't had a violent impact upon my existence. And therefore, people are sort of saying, oh, well, this is an attack on my culture. And I think it's, what I'm saying is, I think the culture war narrative is existing because white people in the UK and in white dominated societies have not actually had any other, a real conversation with themselves about what is my culture, what is, what is our culture built upon, because actually the culture is built upon colonialism, white supremacy, all of these institutions. And it's a very, very uncomfortable conversation to have with yourself, that you are a product of that system, and so I can see why there's this sort of digging your nails in to try and cling on to this sort of weird, nostalgic, unproblematic, comfortable perception of our history as a nation, or of our nation's culture, which of course it isn't. It's not comfortable. It's extremely uncomfortable and unsettling.
It's like I don't know if you've seen it, the Piers Morgan interview on Good Morning America.
I don't watch that guy, man. Seriously, he just fucks me off.
So there's a video I found. So I was watching Akala videos. I don't know if you guys know Akala. I was watching his videos, and then the video popped up, and I was like, wait, okay, let's see what this is about. And then there was, I forgot her name. There was a lady there, and she was basically speaking about what the seminar is about. She was basically the abolishment of statues because of what they stood for, the history that they have. And then Pierce was like, when you try to hold on to reality because you don't want to believe that someone was a racist or colonialist. Like Pierce was just saying, but come on, like he helped stop the Leopold War, and like it was funny to watch because he didn't want to face the facts that like Churchill was, well, can't say it. I think it's already been said. Like, there's a lot of history behind a lot of these things. So it's like, I see what you're saying. It's like to hold on to that reality that, you know, my history is being attacked or something. I get what you mean.
And being in this generation, obviously, like, I'm just sort of taking a look around. I'm like, I don't understand how that is part of, like. So I've obviously interrogated the fact that Britain is built upon, you know, those things, and I accept that. Therefore, I'm a product of that. But in terms of my emphatic kind of identification with that Britain, I don't want to identify with that Britain. I don't see myself as part of that Britain. I want to be part of something else. So in terms of the culture war, you know, it just seems so completely tone deaf, because I think anyone in this generation can look around, you know, the society and quite easily say, you know, this is the Britain I want to live in. This is not the Britain that I want to live in. And the statues, I think, are, you know, like when I saw what's his face come down, Colston, it was joyful. It was like there was something really, like, deeply joyful about that. And I think it was there was a sculpture expert was talking about it. And statues are history. They are that thing we agree on, and then we sort of we crystallize that history and we plonk it on a plinth, and that is history set in stone or metal. You know, it is cast, and therefore the taking down of Colston was to reanimate that history and to reappropriate that history, to take something that was deemed hegemonic, a statue, nothing is more hegemonic than a statue, and then take it down and chuck it in a river. You know, it was, and it changed in that act. So no, I definitely think that, yeah, our history is not set in stone, and we have to make active efforts to revisit it.
Yeah, 100%. Tale, you wanted to say something. You keep putting your mic on.
Yeah. So I just wanted to ask, like, so Ivan, what good things do you know about British history, or what would you want your kids or your grandchildren to know? What kind of history would you want them to? What kind of history would you want them to know about Britain?
That's a really good question, because it's like, it's like, can you save anything from a burning building? Can you save anything from a sinking ship? Like, I think as a Welsh person, I would definitely emphasize, obviously, you know, like Wales, like aspects of Welsh culture were attempted to be stamped out by and stuff. So I would definitely emphasize Welsh culture. So for example, I'll use the example of, I've been watching a bunch of documentaries on YouTube that I just stumbled across about UK music from like the 19 sort of like, well, it was about UK electronic music. That was everything from like the start of like acid house and jungle, and then through to like UK garage and bassline and all this kind of stuff. And they obviously went back to Windrush, and then you had stuff like, you know, Rocksteady, the skinhead movement, the two-tone movement. Like, to be honest, like, as an anthropologist, I'm not that concerned about really, really old history. I don't really give a shit about Henry VIII or the 100 Years' War, or, you know, to be honest, stuff that actually still exists within our society. I think I would just try and teach my kids about looking around the society we live in, and yeah, how we got here. So that is teaching them about Windrush, about the Empire, about the Industrial Revolution, the miners' strike, you know, Thatcher. Like, yeah, I think, yeah. So no, it is a difficult question, man, because I honestly, I wouldn't want to make, you know, because that's the other thing that's always said, like, oh, well, you know, you hate Britain or you're anti-British. I'm not. Like, that's the whole point, is I can't choose where I was born. I was born in this country, and I have to believe, I have to hope that it is salvageable and that it's not just full of shit. So, you know, I do try and keep that hope in mind. There is something that can be done.
I feel you, because I mean, I do ask myself these questions like on a regular, you know. So like, I'm from Zambia, I'm from Africa, so like I just wonder what I would want my grandchildren to know about my generation, you know, like what was monumental, and is it people knowing more about their worth, and just, you know, people that understood that racism was, you know, indeed a backward way of thinking or living, you know what I mean? Like, I just ask myself such questions. So it's interesting to hear, you know, what other people think. And also I wanted to say something about, you know, the issue of reparations. So like how much do you think colonialism has taken away from, let's say, Africa? And how much do you think they're able to pay back, or are they going to be able to actually pay back, and how, you know?
I'd just like to chip in for 1 minute, which is, you know, I was supposed to mention it, but then I decided to take it out of the presentation. But Haiti, so was the first, formerly, like it was the first island in the Caribbean that it was enslaved people who rebelled, killed all the white people there, or like killed most of the white people there, and declared themselves their own republic. And that was in 1804. And from then till 1947, they paid a debt to France, which comes up to 21 billion US dollars in today's money. And that is like in the 1800s. And that is largely responsible. That is the reason why Haiti is so poor. And it's why Haiti was completely unable to deal with the disasters that it went through. And, you know, France was like, oh, we'll help you deal with this disaster. And it's like, of course, I mean, yeah, you caused this disaster because you caused capitalism, which is responsible for this disaster in the first place, and is responsible for how people are vulnerable to it. And so to answer your question, I think they're completely incapable of doing it. They have taken way too much, and the balance, there is no balance. There's like, and I don't think it's possible to I don't think it's really possible. It's going to be, I don't,
Yeah, it goes back to what Harvey brought up as well. Harvey, you have your hands up again.
I don't see it. Oh, I think you're the only one that can see it because you're the host.
And I think you've got to click on participants. And then you can also put your hand up there. Anyway, yeah. No, I was just going to say, it's like, how can you tell like a guy literally like stabbing you and like stealing your wallet, and then say, as he's like taking out the money, say, can you give me my money back? And then he keeps taking money back. And he say like a guy takes 100 quid from you, and you're like, can I have 90 quid back? He's like, all right. And then he takes another 200 quid. The point is, you got to stop it being taken right now. It's not just a case of giving back. It's a case of it's literally kept on being stolen through stuff like predatory loans, through stuff like, you know, companies massively exploiting in the continent today, stuff like, well, everything, like, you know, the entire neoliberal system and the entire imperialist system that comes with it. I think the only way you can ever like truly give reparations is if you stop the active stealing today.
Amen. Drew also has his hand up.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Harvey has a point. The thing is, the whole conversation of reparation is like, it's so huge. And for example, going back to what Issa was talking about Haiti. I mean, Haiti was supposed to pay a huge sum of money, and that was like a really long time ago. So if you look at it, it's really confusing in the sense that now you expect it. I mean, Haiti was, at some point, it was really vulnerable, and then France only paid like a fraction of what you got from Haiti just to help out. And till now, Haiti is like one of the poorest nations, if not the poorest nation. And with what's happening with Africa, you find that we get we get grants from like Western countries almost every single year, right? But you find that they're still getting so much from us. It goes back to what Javi was saying back in the chart. It's I mean, we got like 150 billion from the West, and then they got like 200 billion. So like the whole racism is like systemic, and it's just really, really horrible.
Yeah, that's the thing. And like going on from that as well, like, and going on from, what you just said, Drew, and what Esau was saying about Haiti. Well, Drew, you said specifically, when Haiti kind of went through, for example, like the earthquake, I think it was 2010 earthquake, and, all of the countries around the world rallied together. And I believe that they contributed a combined $13 billion to Haiti for the earthquake. So this was all the countries, the Western countries that teamed together, which is less than the $21 billion that, just solely France stole from Haiti. And then at the same time, they come in with like this white savior complex, like, we're here to help, like, without us, you'd be in disaster. But really, this white savior complex is ridiculous, because it's money that is owed. As I said in the presentation, this is money that they deserve. This is money that was stolen from them. And so it can't be seen as like, white European countries helping. The money just needs to be repaid. And I think, in the seminar that we talked about climate justice, I kind of touched on the idea of like climate reparations, the fact that, we're approaching a climate disaster, or arguably we're in a climate disaster. And so countries that don't have the resources and don't have the infrastructure to deal with like kind of natural, or it's like natural occurrences, but not really natural occurrences, like things like earthquakes and stuff. They don't have the money to deal with that. So the Western countries that have stolen that money need to give it back in order to safeguard them from these atrocities that is just going to damage them more. But obviously, arguably again, we can't really do that unless we just completely deconstruct this system that we live in. Goes back to the same thing that I was saying earlier, like it's a capitalist system, and capitalism was founded on thieving. So can you change a system that was created that way? It's interesting. It's like a quote that I saw recently on somebody's like banner at a march. I think I said this in a previous seminar, and it basically says, you can't, or like the system can't be broken if it was designed that way, if it was designed to enslave us, if it was designed to, thieve and all of this. The system is not broken because, as I said, as Esau said, it was designed to subjugate Black people. It was designed for inequality. So we don't need to change the system. We need a new system.
Yeah, like one thing, I mean, for example, even in this country, the Green Party was suggesting that we should all be stakeholders in the country's natural resources, and in terms of, you look at, expropriation of resources from Africa, and the fact that so much land is owned and so many resources are taken out of the continent, like, and obviously there's dimensions of it with climate and stuff, so we can't just say like, well, okay, let's just people can do whatever they want. Each nation can do whatever they want with their resources. But in terms of as Harvey said, if the person's still stealing from you, you need to stop them stealing from you. So obviously, if individual countries, nationalize their resources, but of course then that comes into a thing of, transnationals are super powerful these days in terms of like they operate much as colonial enterprises did. I mean, the first companies were set up under colonialism. So capitalism and colonialism have effectively always existed as twins, effectively.
Yep, Drew, you have your hand up. Drew, did you want to say something?
Okay. Yes, I did. So the conversation on reparations, on my part, I feel is a bit complex because, every single government has its own view on it. But like just this year alone, the US gave out close to like 6 trillion, just for the COVID response. And they've been avoiding the conversation on reparations for the longest time. And yet they have, this money at hand. And you can see the hypocrite type of people these governments are.
Yeah, 100%. Like, I read a really interesting article, which was on, I don't know if anyone is following like the new like Progressive International, but they wrote about they were talking about what we can take away from this COVID pandemic. And they talked about that fact, governments right now, like the UK government has pledged so much money to help, small businesses during like quarantine. And so they were talking about the facts, well, specifically on the topic of climate, the fact that we have literally been pushing away like any discussion of how we can implement like change to kind of stop climate change. And we argue that we just don't have the money to do it, blah blah blah. But anyway, the article, which was written on the Progressive International site, was basically talking about the fact that if they have that money to do this, then they have the money to make these changes for a better climate. And like you said, Drew, they have this money to give like as reparations to countries. It's just, what is more important to them.
I think what governments tend to do is they put money where they perceive there is value, and they just don't think BAME people in this country are valuable. They don't think that the working class are valuable. They just push all their money into what's going to benefit their own peers in our hugely unrepresentative government that we've got right now. And yeah, I don't believe for a second that there's no money to do all these things that we want to do. And I just think they just don't want to spend it on things that they don't think are important to them.
There's not a single thief that's willing to pay back what they stole,
Exactly.
Where is the lie, Tale? That was perfect. So yeah, does anybody have any other thoughts or projects to take down statues or I don't know, maybe, yeah, whatever in your... Oh, Chaba, you have something to say.
Oh, no. I just wanted to see if it worked. I also wanted to see if they're raising the hand. I just wanted to... Sorry.
No worries.
We're hopefully going to get a statue taken down. Not like me, but like Cardiff is attempting to organise to get a guy taken out of its Hall of Heroes, which is very ironic when this is a guy called Thomas Picton, who, because he died at Waterloo fighting Napoleon, everyone kind of forgot that he tortured people in Trinidad. So yeah, basically the Lord Mayor of Cardiff, Daniel Daff, who has sort of he's basically said it's his kind of incumbent duty as Cardiff's first black Lord Mayor. Is sort of, he's written expressly to council to get them to take it down, and the councillors backed it. Council leaders basically said that, with a democratic mandate, he's very happy to take down the statue. And I think, given the number of people I saw at the protest the past couple of weeks, I hope that that's going to happen. So yeah, watch this space, I guess.
I
guess I've got so what do you say to, I guess the main argument on the other side, I guess there's two. One of them, I guess, is that if you focus purely on their negative, you'll find negatives in everyone. So are we holding them to too high a negative standard? Is the moral standard we've got too high? I think there are several statues which, once I've done the research, it's definitely clear that they should be toppled, they should go down. But when I start thinking about this more, I'm starting to think about, okay, the people on the other side, I guess probably the way they're thinking is the floor's coming under their feet, and suddenly they're in this sort of situation where, oh, what I once thought was the true history isn't the correct history. I think it's definitely fair that we should try and change history so that we stop saying, like, Winston Churchill, for example, is absolute, like, God or absolutely pure, when obviously it's come to light that he was actually quite a horrid man and things like this. But I'm thinking in terms of changing the other side's perspective, what do you think's the best way of doing that? Because I guess I worry that this might be taking down lots of statues might be stemming more racism. And although I do think this history should be rewritten, I'm wondering if there's a way of educating which should take precedence rather than taking all statues down. Because at the end of the day, if people are educated, they're not going to worship the statues. But I'm wondering what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a really difficult aspect of white supremacy, is that in order to deconstruct it, we find ourselves in this position where we have to cater to white people putting their feelings before Black lives and experiences, Black or brown lives and experiences. And it's kind of, it's a bit difficult because I totally see where you're coming from, and or where they're coming from. And I could, like, if I was in a conversation with someone, maybe I would say, like, oh, but taking it down doesn't mean that it's going to be burnt. We can stick it in a museum, or we can put a plaque that explains. This is often the arguments that are used against that. But yeah, it's and I totally see what you mean when you say that we're by taking these statues down, people get really defensive, and there's a bit of a height in racism because people get defensive and they think, this is my heritage, my culture that you're taking away. But they should listen to this seminar is what I should say.
Yeah, and I think, like, adding on to that, so I was saying that I was writing an article today. So basically the article is about how even if we remove statues, we're not removing racism. And kind of what you were touching on, the fact that we need to educate people, and obviously, like, people should do that out of their own kind of responsibility, and it's not really our job to go out and educate everybody. But as a system, as the establishment, we need, like, a change of curriculum. We need to really just change up the whole kind of just how we're taught things. The whole structure of white supremacy literally covers, like, from going to school to, like, our whole media system, all of this. We basically just need to, like, completely refigure that and start injecting, like, true knowledge. Because you're right, like, you're right in the sense that, yeah, taking statues down isn't necessarily solving a problem. It's a very, like, powerful gesture. However, it does not annihilate racism, and yeah, it doesn't annihilate racist people, and now they have an excuse. But it's a step in the right direction, because it removes the trauma that Black people have to experience have to endure when they see these statues. And your argument kind of first off, like, oh, can anybody meet the standards? Like, I don't even think it's a high standard not to, like, massacre people and torture them and rape them. Like, I feel like that should just be decent humanity.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess like, I would like personally, but maybe because I think way too obsessively and list orientated, but I'd like there to be a list somewhere. These are the most important people to remove, and we remove them. I guess it's just because, firstly, for educational purposes, I'll know these are the worst people, and maybe it is being done. Maybe people have research and finding these are the worst people to go for. But then I guess on the other side as well, the people might be able to say, like, okay, you can't really argue with the worst people. And as you get down the list, I guess it gets maybe less important, and people already attune that, oh, wow, we have really horrible historical figures in our history. I'm more attuned to the fact that some of these people I put on a pedestal aren't that good. But yeah, no, thank you for the answer.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting. It kind of reminds me of what Isolde was saying in our last seminar about feminism, how we kind of venerate. I think she was talking about the white American like abolitionists, suffragettes, and she was saying that these people, you know, the white suffragettes were actually like racist, and you know, when Black people got the vote before them, they just like completely turned away from, you know, any joint care. But the fact that we still, you know, Isolde was saying last seminar that in the Hillary, wasn't it like when they voted for Hillary, they're all sticking like stickers like, oh, we voted on these suffragette statues, which is great because, yeah, the suffragettes, you know, they did allow certain women to get the vote, but as Isolde said again, like in the last seminar, like it was only certain women, it was only white women, and Black women were completely left out of the conversation. So we need to, I'm not saying we should take down every single statue of somebody that's been problematic, although, you know, maybe we should, but I think the thing is educating people, as you've said, like obviously take the statues down, but also let people know why they're wrong. When we learn about feminism at school, let's talk about, you know, feminism. Let's talk about intersectional feminism. Let's talk about the racism of, you know, the suffragist like movements.
Yeah, and I think let's talk about white supremacy and call it as such, because I think one of the reasons why people get so defensive when people topple down statues and things like that is because they don't, or even when we say things like, oh, but should we erase everyone from history? Because the more you learn, the more you realize that actually a lot of our history here in Western Europe is very colonial, very racist. And, you know, and I think it's perhaps even not even about removing them, maybe just moving them and putting them in a museum instead of having them in our streets glorified, but also kind of realizing that, yeah, everything around us is white supremacist because, you know, for 400 years, we've worked really, really hard to maintain and uphold the system. So it really, once you kind of learn them, I mean, it's always surprising, you know, when you read some of this shit, but like, it's, because everything is white supremacist, it's like kind of the chicken or the egg a little bit, you know?
I'm really interested, Basil, about how you said about the rug analogy. And it's sort of, I guess, similar to what you asked me, Tally, about sort of what aspects of British history would I save? And I think because we have a white supremacist history, you know, there is a tendency, initial reaction with this sort of this taking down of statues and stuff, to think that we're getting rid of our history, you know, and you know, so I think if we you know, oh yeah, obviously with direct that stuff, yeah, if we just take the statues down and then we expect that to solve anything, no, it obviously won't. So, you know, I think, yeah, we should probably take some symbolic ones down, and then, you know, we should, like Afua Hirsch was talking about, we need a museum of empire, and not just like a fucking drab, dry museum. We need like some, you know, like the Museum of Terror in Berlin, or like Yad Vashem, you know, in Israel. We need something that
we have some.
Yeah, some sort of.
We actually have a section in our National Museum, you know, a section where they just shame people that just brought terror. And like it's a whole lot of things about all these people, and kids get to learn about it.
I think that's the thing is if you're gonna, you know, yes, you are to an extent creating a historical void if you take down the statue, but if you fill that with something, you know, it's the question of you know, if we therefore, you know, so if we have a white supremacist culture, you know, it's a question of, so what are we going to do about our history or about our culture, which therefore we can take forward into the future, you know, and in that sense, you know, you're not pulling the rug from under anyone. You're saying, you know, this is what's happened, you know, this is the system that is still going on, and if we don't do something differently, we're going to reproduce that. You know, that's an imperative to do something about it. That's not, it's, you know, it's not an erasure of history. It's an encouragement to help co-create a more inclusive history in the future.
Yeah. Harvey, you have your hand up.
I was just going to say, I think that's a really interesting point about. Sorry, what I was actually going to say is I've had ever since like the statues started been removed, I've had far more constructive conversations with other white people, like like my mum or family, or even just like people I know outside of it, than I have ever before, because people actually realise there's genuine anger and there's genuine frustration with these things, especially after like stuff like George Floyd. I know someone who wants to be a police officer who's actively denouncing like the racism of police in America and even here, like that kind of thing, far better than we've been able to talk about it before. So I think that the destruction of statues was absolutely like a positive thing in that kind of like educational regard, because it means people have actually be forced to listen effectively. But I think it's also really interesting about what you're talking about, like how history and statues intertwine, and the idea that a lot of people have a rhetoric of, well, if you destroy statues during history. And it was just interesting, especially when like Lisa was saying earlier about like Macron saying, if you destroy these statues, you're going to be destroying history and we're against the destruction of history. No, because what it is effectively is we're not destroying history, we're telling history in a different way in which we think is the correct way, and you are arguing for the current status quo of history, the current status quo of how history is told, and that's because that status quo benefits you and anyone who's supporting you. And then it obviously then ties into the whole system of that. But obviously I think it's a very interesting piece of rhetoric, and it's very interesting how we can reply to that.
Yeah, because essentially we are just being more accurate with history, like not erasing it at all. Drew, who has his hand up.
So I'm thinking, like, what's the whole basis of taking down the statues? Like, and the thing is, like, I was watching BBC some time back, and I saw, is it the English Defence League? They came out saying that they were trying to protect the statues, and like, then they got into a scuffle with the police and everything. I feel like a lot of people are not educated enough on why the statues are there, because I know my part, I think the statues are there as a symbol, yes, because like let's talk about the Churchill statue. Churchill was like a huge, British figure, and like, he's put there because he was like a prime minister, and everyone recognizes him for like many great things and what he did in the World War II. But like, another thing is he was also a racist. So let's look at that. Like, what racist things did he do? You know what I mean? So like, why do we need to still have a statue of him? Because like, I'll give an example of Leopold, King Leopold. In Belgium, he's almost like a celebrated man. But like, if you look at the things he did in the Congo, almost 10 million Africans were killed during his reign. And this is something that isn't mentioned so much in the history book, and they choose to omit it. So I feel like a lot of people should be educated on like why some of these historic figures should be taken down and not idolizing them with statues.
Yeah, 100%. Like, I feel like now, because even we look at like Roads Must Fall, that's been going on for years, and it's only just now that Oxford College has decided to back it. They haven't like officially taken it down yet, but they're looking into it now. But that's it's taken so long. Like, and it's not just within the UK that we have this structure of white supremacy, but even in like as I said earlier, even in the former colonies, it's still there, and still like arguably like the cultural remnants of colonialism. Well, colonialism never left, and like cultural domination and cultural imperialism never left either. I don't know if anybody from the African continent wants to talk about current cultural domination, but yeah. Drew, do you still have your hand up, or have you forgotten to put it down? Okay. Yeah, does anyone have anything else to say? If not, perhaps we'll end.
Just a quick thing. I think it would be interesting if we took statues down and put statues up in place? Like, has anyone had a thought of like who would want to put up that kind of, I guess they don't even have to be British, but someone who's like in history, like represents, you know, something we want to say, okay, this is what we want in Britain. Or anyone got any ideas? I guess it might not have to, probably won't be done, but I was just interested what anyone's opinions were of people that
Some
should.
good news actually is that Central Square in Cardiff, which is a new development, that they wanted a statue in the middle of that square, and there was a national poll done on it, and it's actually going to be a woman called Betty Davis, who is head teacher. So that's going to be pretty much as soon as you come out of Cardiff station. So, you know, it like hopefully it's like kind of, you know, not one door another opens, but maybe one statue falls and another goes up, I guess. So yeah, that's, you know, I was quite pleased when we heard about that.
Also, I was watching a video when I was researching for this by a man. It was an interview by The Guardian of someone called David Oluska, and I think he's a British historian. I know him because he's done a documentary where he traces like archives, like British Jamaican archives about slavery, and he like led this enquête thing to find out how much Britain, like financially, how much Britain paid for slave owners around abolition. Anyway, he's an interesting guy. And he was talking about how statues are, you know, they're really dated and they don't correspond to what people like appreciate art-wise today. And he was saying, you know, he was looking at all the other forms of art that exist around the UK, and they're much more abstract, much more expressive. They're not just some statue of a man. So he was saying, you know, there are many places that we can go, and I think, you know, there's also art that's in honor of like, I don't think we should necessarily replace, you know, a statue of Churchill with a memorial of all the fucked up shit that he did, but like you know, there are memorials or statues in the honor and in memory of those who were subjugated to all of this that we're talking about. So I think there's different directions that we can go with this.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I like that, like maybe we don't need to put up statues. There's all these different abstract art forms, and I guess that probably that expresses who we are today rather than some old dead dude.
Exactly. And it can be very political, you know. It can be talking about, you know, I don't know, perhaps like anger against such and such thing, but still just not being, I don't know. I'll send the video in the resources anyway. But
okay, thanks.
Otherwise, we might call it a day if there's no other
comments. But yeah, this was a really interesting conversation. And honestly, peeps in the UK, like, go take these down. Like in France, it's not happening. It's happening in Martinique and in Guadeloupe and stuff, but it's not happening in the metropole, at least not that I've really heard of. So, at least, I mean, our president doesn't even recognize that police brutality is a thing. So we're not there yet, I think. But yeah.
Like, obviously, in the presentation, I was talking about how they've updated Desecration of War Memorials bill. So now, if you do it, you might get 10 years in prison.
Oh yeah, I love that.
But yeah, it's very fucked up.